Dragonites, this is DraycosDragon. Welcome to another video. If you haven't seen the past Thoughtful Thursdays videos, the link to them will be in the description below. But for now, as you probably have seen from the intro, the topic for today's Thoughtful Thursdays is about gaming. Between before 2010 and after 2010. There's a reason behind this, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, basically this is going to be a comparison version of the series. We'll start with the updates and additions. Before 2010, every 1 to 3 months roughly, sometimes up to 6 months, they add hype and anticipation because they like games before 2010 used to wait until there's multiple things to update and do maintenance on all at once. That way they would get advertising out, they would get information out to social medias, etc. Plus, if the people were interested in the game enough and they thought the upcoming updates were interesting, they actually would wait. Nowadays, game companies don't even give that more than a week. Normally it's about 24 hours to 7 days roughly, and that gives almost no wait time, and if anything, it doesn't really give any advance notice about what changes are about to come up. So that takes away all the hype and all the anticipation for games, which is basically what makes some of the games nowadays less interesting than they used to be. Next, we'll get into the offline gaming. Whenever you had a game that was offline, which was probably the beginning of PS2 and everything before that kind of era, players had time to enjoy the games and get a chance to replay a game that they enjoy the most. If they didn't like the game, they would trade it, or they would sell it to hopefully get a better game. And this would keep going until they find one that they enjoy the most, and they would keep that game. However, currently, or nowadays, after 2010, players almost never play games more than once. Sure, they have games like Minecraft, which are infinite play, but there's no loop there. There's no branches there. It's just one type of game, just mining, crafting, and building. That's about it. And with a little bit of creation, of course, I will admit that. But there's not really much else. Sure, there's using a sword and bow and arrow, but that's something you can get in any game, really. Nowadays, once a game is played right from start to finish, people don't want to play it anymore, which brings down the popularity at that point. Now, as for online games, there's two parts for this. There's the waiting, and then there's the interactive part. The waiting part, it used to take about, I would say, 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the size of the game, between the time you hit start and or join lobby or join game, whatever, to the moment the game actually starts for you. This would give players time to prep, get hyped for the game, etc. There was nowadays there's almost no wait time, which means no prep time, no chance to get all hyped up. You're literally going right into the game, which a lot of people actually hate. I mean, a lot of people like that because some people don't really have anything to do, so they would just sit there waiting. So I can see that point of view, but at the same time, most people who play games, at least most people at the time, before 2010, used to actually play with each other, like face to face, in the same room and everything. There was no, oh, we'll just play in our own buildings, our own countries, whatever, and just play online. Which brings up the next part. Before 2010, games weren't too focused on PvP. Nowadays, it's, or back then, it was GTA 1 through 4, I would say. Then there was EverQuest Online Adventures. There was Halo 1 and 2. There were some cartoony ones like Looney Tunes Adventures, for example, or Ants, or Bug's Life. There's always some kind of game where it's not just the gamers that have to play it. Sometimes kids will want to play, sometimes adults and elderly people want to play. It's something that wasn't, I mean, they had a challenge, but it was more created in a more simple way. They had more simple styles, whereas nowadays games after 2010 not as creative, is not as simplified, which makes it even harder for people like kids under, I would say, 13 to play, or for elderly people who don't understand game consoles. They won't understand how to play either. Mostly, not always. Don't give me any comments saying that I hate elderly. That's not what I mean. But yeah, they have challenges, but it's not really as challenging as the games used to be before 2010. Because games nowadays, it's not a challenge when you're facing another person. That's more of a risk or a chance. A challenge is facing the game itself. There's no challenge in facing a game when you're facing other players in that game. There's, if anything, most of the time, people either modify the game, or find hacks, or use bots, or some other way to go around the whole easy stuff, just because it's too easy. It's pretty bad when people are using mods and bots and hacks and all this just to get past the easy stuff, which basically proves my point that nowadays it's not really much of a challenge, since you're not facing the game's challenge. You're facing each other. If I wanted to face someone else, I would play something like Mario Party, which has been around since Nintendo 64 era. Or I would play well, some of you might know this if you're from the 90s and 80s. Or I would play F-Zero GX or the Monopoly Junior. You remember those games that came in cereal boxes? Yeah, that type of game. But that's more of a party type of game, which is basically what you're forcing people to do with all these online only games where people are always challenging each other, not challenging the game. You're forcing them to play. I mean, you're not forcing them to play the game, you're forcing them to play against each other. There should be ways for people to play offline, for those who who prefer the more player versus game type of challenge, not player versus player type of challenge. Next part that I want to bring up is the graphics. Not the visual graphics, but the hardware. Before 2010, very little games relied extremely heavily on graphics cards, or video cards, or audio cards, or whatever. Back then, everything could be run on a browser. They could be run on Intel HD. It could be run on Intel before HD became a thing for Intel. There were no you need to have this type of graphics, or this type of PCI or PCIe slot, or this type of graphics cards. Before you play almost anything, as long as you had a computer that had enough memory to run the game, you were free to play it. Nowadays, almost no game is like that. Almost no game nowadays. I don't know very many games that are still around from back then that are playable on any kind of PC, whether it's something from 2006 or 2016 or 1990s, for example. At the time, you were able to play on almost anything. Nowadays, you can't really play almost anything without a graphics card of some type. And Intel HD does not count anymore as a graphics card. At the time it did, I'll admit that. But nowadays, it doesn't count. In fact, most websites and most checkers, like PC checkers, don't actually register an Intel HD anymore. Which brings me to the next part, which is digital versus physical. Before 2010, you had to have a physical copy of a game. So if you broke a game, or if the game broke in the machine, you would have to throw that out, or return it, or whatever, or go to a repair place to fix or replace that physical game, which would thus give companies more chance to make money off that game. Nowadays, all you have to do is download a game. If you have it downloaded right and the game itself breaks, or the game itself lags or gets glitchy, all you have to do is either find a program to fix it, or uninstall and reinstall the program. You don't have to go out and buy anything else, which thus gives companies less chance of making more money off the game. Another difference is a game that was broken. Another thing that's different is at the time you had to have either a memory dock, such as what the the original Xbox and Xbox One, not Xbox One, the original Xbox and Xbox 360 both had, or you had to get what was called a memory card, which is what the PS1 and the PS2 both had. Actually, now that I think about it, I believe some of the GameCubes actually had that as well. Nowadays, if you replace a game or you remove a game for, I'm going to say, a couple, 2 or 3 years, and then return to that game, your game will still be saved, but it's not on a physical copy or a physical little disc or card, which brings up another problem. This is company-wise. Companies would actually be making more money if they still made the memory docks or memory cards, because as soon as someone breaks one of them, or the machine breaks one of them, the player or user had to go out and buy a new one or a replacement one, or go to some kind of company that would actually replace it or repair it for you. Nowadays, you don't need any of that. If a file is broken or corrupt, there's nothing to replace or repair, which means no money for the company. Because then all that means is the person has to play the entire thing all over again, no matter how far they are, even if they're like an hour away from the end of a game. Another thing, this part I don't mind too much. We're getting into the AR/VR stuff. For those who are unaware, AR is augmented reality, and VR is virtual reality. Before 2010, you didn't need anything to imagine visually that there's for example, a dragon on the wall, or a dinosaur on a bed. At the time, you just played a game, physically played it. Nowadays, you need to pick up a phone. There's one. You need to pick up a phone and go like this the entire time, trying to find things. And that's for augmented reality. Virtual reality, you need an entire headset, which half the time is like twice the size of your own head, just so you can see what reality would be like in other various ways. Here's an idea for those who are wanting to experience reality. It's called reality. Go outside, experience reality. Go out of the room, experience reality. You don't need a frickin' system or headset just to experience reality. And nowadays, almost everything requires or has a variation that includes augmented reality or virtual reality, AV or RV, VR or AR. That's what I meant to say. Next part, we're almost done here. Next part is the PC versus console stuff. We'll start with the console stuff. Before 2010, for consoles, you had more challenges, but fewer buttons or button combos. Whereas nowadays, for consoles, you have almost no challenge, yet usually the same amount of buttons, just aligned differently on the physical console or remote or controller or whatever you want to call it. And nowadays they're so close together. It's pretty easy to get each one. At least before 2010, all the buttons were, I'm going to say, the consoles were about like this, so it's about 4 to 6 inches long to about 2 to 4 inches wide, roughly. So it would take a little bit of it would just have a bit of a challenge on its own trying to get all the buttons. Some people that have longer thumbs and longer fingers will be able to do it. Some people that have shorter fingers or shorter thumbs will have a lot more of a challenge. So that gives a physical challenge right there. Next is the PC part. You still have the same buttons, only before you used to have the old brick things, which for people like me, I was actually always used to it. I mean, it was a little bit louder, but it was still usable. There's nothing wrong with it. Nowadays, you could almost it's almost impossible nowadays to hear a computer keyboard. Plus, they're very small. This is probably about 2/3 the size of a keyboard from about 8 to 10 years ago. Plus, I mean, you would have more keys and more key combos to use either way compared to a console, but you would also have some challenge because you would have to constantly slide your hand and fingers all over the keyboard. PCs nowadays, with the smaller ones, you don't have as much of a challenge. You do still have a bit of a challenge, but you don't have as much of a challenge. Only challenge is if others give a challenge, which means you don't challenge the computer. You don't, or get challenged by the computer. You don't challenge or get challenged by a video game or a computer game. Nowadays, you get challenged by the actual player, which I kind of mentioned earlier. Otherwise, there's very little challenge. The only challenge you have otherwise is just you're just trying to get your hands and fingers in the right spots to get each key. And half of the time you have to keep swinging your hand over to get the mouse every once in a while. Now the final part is the multiplayer stuff in general. Back in and before 2010, most games had to be played locally, which means you'd have to have people within the actual room, or within the actual, well, within about, I'm going to say 12 to 15 feet max, depending on the console or the controller's cord or whatever. Most games had to be played locally, which only required people to be in the same room, and that also required people to social in real life friends, not online friends. That's completely different. Just because you call people online your friends doesn't mean that they are actually your friend. Friends are normally there for each other. Friends aren't normally looking out for each other. Friends are normally there for someone to, in case someone needs to cry on them or let out their frustrations or whatever else. Nowadays, almost no game requires locally play or local players, which means almost no one needs to be in the same room anymore. You can be anywhere across the world, even you could be in somewhere in China and play with someone in, say, the northern half of Canada, for example, while also playing with someone in, let's say, Brazil, and then the fourth person would be in Australia. You could be all over the world and still play together, but that would mean less real life friends, ones you can actually meet in person. This also means that there's um, this also means that you can't socialize as much. You can't go out as much. You'll be at your own computer or own console, or sometimes both, just to talk to someone, just to play games with someone. You don't have to do that. There's a whole world out there which almost no one seems to care about anymore, all because games took over. Which actually brings me to something else that I haven't written down. Another issue I've found recently is, before, game companies used to actually listen to their consumers. So the games, if they, that's why games like Grand Theft Auto went from only one game to almost a dozen games in, I would say, 10 to 12 years. So the way I see it, or back then, game companies would actually listen to the consumers. If they had a problem, they would talk with them properly, and together they could figure out a way around these problems. If they couldn't find a way around these problems, then the game company or game creator would try to install a solution to the problem in the next update. Nowadays, game companies don't seem to really care about what their consumers say or what consumers want. Instead, they just think about the money. I mean, sure, they need the money to expand and grow and make all these other games and consoles and whatnot. But at the same time, there has to be some kind of line between caring about money and caring about the consumers. So, in my opinion, just to sum this all up before I ramble too much more, in my opinion, games before 2010 were a lot better than the games nowadays after 2010. After 2010. At least that's my opinion. Let me know. I don't know. For some reason, it just seems to be more pros than cons for 2010, whereas after 2010, there's more cons than pros. So you guys let me know what you think in the comment section below. You can also go to Reddit, the subreddit page, which is r/THEDKC. That's r/the Dragon Knight, or the DKC, which is like this community, the Dragon Knight crew, DKC for short. I think that's pretty much it. The next Thoughtful Thursdays video will actually be a group one, so watch out for that. That will be on February 28th. So yeah, watch out for that, and if you like this video, fire up the like button, fire up the subscribe button if you haven't already and you want to see more. Also, let me know what future topics you want me to talk about for Thoughtful Thursdays. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it. So I guess I will talk to you during Dragon Knights later. See ya.